This Bayonetta 2 review will contain spoilers for many aspects of the game, including the story, gameplay tricks, weapons, and unlockables. I highly recommend you play or finish the game before watching this video. Bayonetta 2 released for the Wii U in 2014, but sparked some controversy during its development. The original Bayonetta came out for the previous generation of consoles on the Xbox 360 and PS3, so for many people the shift from these consoles to Nintendo was wrongly seen as a betrayal. The reality is that the first game was created through a deal with Sega, and while the sequel was in development, the company made the decision to suspend Bayonetta 2's creation. Platinum attempted to make offers to various publishers, but Nintendo was the only one that showed any interest. Because of Nintendo, development resumed and the game was completed. The only alternative Platinum had to releasing the game on the Wii U was to cancel the project entirely, so to blame the development team for the situation is pretty stupid. Furthermore, copies of Bayonetta 2 come with the first game for free in an attempt to bring people who are new to the franchise up to speed, while also giving those unfortunate souls with the PS3 version of the game a copy with fewer frame rate drops. Like the first game, Bayonetta 2 follows an Umbra Witch of the same name with fantastic powers and otherworldly weaponry as she traverses the modern-day human world as well as heaven and hell in order to save her best friend and ascend the legendary mountain of Thimbleventer. Similar to its predecessor, the game begins in the midst of things during an attack by angels. This provides a space for the player to experiment with their moveset, while narration in the background gives some context into the game's lore. There's no score ranking to worry about, so players can experiment all they like without fear of punishment. Just like Bayonetta 1 though, it can be difficult to follow the narration while simultaneously fighting for someone who's just getting used to the controls. As I just mentioned, the section isn't scored, meaning someone could simply ignore the enemies to listen to the narration, but most people aren't going to do that the first time around. Following this section is the game's tutorial, which is almost perfect. Firstly, punching and kicking are introduced, blocking out most of the other buttons the player would be able to press to reduce confusion. After this, the game explains combos and even presents a list of all the ones Bayonetta can perform up to this point. The player can spend as much or as little time as they want practicing combos, as each tutorial section allows you to choose when you want to advance to the next phase. Immediately after learning the buttons for dealing damage, the tutorial introduces Bayonetta's defensive mechanics, dodging and witch time. By the end of this blissfully brief tutorial, the player has the two basic aspects of combat to practice, dealing damage and avoiding it. Bayonetta 2 is a game with critically important defensive mechanics, so I'm glad Platinum devoted almost as much time to explaining dodging as they did to attacking. Finally, veterans of the first game or people who just don't enjoy tutorials can opt out of the lesson entirely, so if the player just wants to jump right into the combat, that option is available to them. Right after the tutorial, the player is dropped into the prologue and the real game begins. The standard Centaur enemies, Acceptance, are easily dispatched and have nicely telegraphed attacks to help practice witch time. After butchering a few of them, the Umbran Climax system is introduced, and it's my favorite new addition to the series. One of my biggest frustrations with the first game is that while summoning demons was extremely exciting, it was generally only used as a quick-time event finisher. The monsters were supposed to be a reward for winning a fight, but to me it often felt like there was a disconnect in what cutscene Bayonetta could do in comparison to my own playable skill set. The Wicked Weaves, or giant punches and kicks the player summons at the end of a combo, while impressive in their own right, just didn't live up to the brutality of the infernal demons for me. When Bayonetta activates Umbran Climax, which costs a full magic gauge, all her standard attacks become Wicked Weaves, and the end of a combo summons one of her demons to deliver a final blow. The sheer variety of summons and attacks is impressive, and they change depending on both specific combos and what weapons Bayo has equipped. The introduction of this system is not without its flaws, however, as Umbran Climax often removes any decision-making on how the player should spend their magic gauge. Special moves like Tetsu Zenoko and Heel Stomp cost 3 orbs and are usually a poor use of your resources. Platinum may have taken that into consideration, though, as Tetsu Zenoko executes a different move depending on what weapon you have equipped and only consumes magic when Bayonetta uses guns. Torture attacks fare better, but only affect one enemy, and while the weapons they create are quite good, it's also extremely rare that using a torture attack would have been a better choice than the extreme AoE damage output, crowd control, and combo point generation the Climax offers. Umbran Spear is pretty useful, but that move was always more advantageous because of its mobility. In any case, at one magic orb, you won't often, if ever, find yourself in a position where you can use it, but not the Umbran Climax, so it's not even a trade-off. After several waves, the first mini-boss, Belief, is introduced. This is the first encounter where a player is unable to brute force their way through everything, as the Angel's attacks are not interruptible. Belief does an exceptional job at trying to teach players to watch for attacks, as its large size and loud audio cues clearly communicate its attempts at damaging Bayonetta. Furthermore, its asymmetric design naturally focuses the player's eyes on its tentacle arm, which is where the bulk of its attacks come from. In an amusing twist, Bayonetta's infernal Gamora is summoned to finish off Belief, only to become the final boss of the prologue himself. Between watching him devour the mini-boss the player just fought, killing Jean, who is arguably as strong as Bayonetta herself, and being one of Bayonetta's most frequently summoned minions in the first title, the game quickly establishes Gamora as an obstacle on a different level from everything up to this point. Bayonetta controls fairly well while in close proximity to the boss, but during the fight he periodically ignores her to start scaling the building. Newer players may get a poor score despite performing well otherwise due to their combo dropping midway through the fight. When he's climbing, Bayo's attacks don't move her closer to him like they do otherwise, and there's not much time for a player to realize this and switch to ranged attacks. There's no mistake that combo drops are the fault of the player, but I understand that a newbie might be frustrated because they have no way of knowing Bayonetta would stop moving closer to Gamora during specific parts of the fight. Trying to shoot him by holding down the punch or kick button in between combos can be awkward at this point, and it's unlikely they would have had much experience with holding down the Y button to maintain a score at this point in the game. This is somewhat of a minor concern though, because the fight is a blast to play otherwise. It's all too common in video games when the largest enemies seem less threatening because their attacks are slow and unwieldy, but Gamora strikes a nice balance early in the game. He's not terribly slow, and the way he shuffles around the skyscraper to get a better position on Bayo adds to his predatory nature. One of the elements that greatly enhances the fight is the dynamic music. Like Metal Gear Rising, the music for bosses in Bayonetta 2 corresponds to the phases in the fight. As Gamora scales the building, the music becomes more and more dramatic until it finally peaks when he reaches the apex. Ultimately, Bayonetta 2's prologue is nearly flawless. It explains the mechanics, allows the player to decide how much time they want to spend practicing, and grabs attention with interesting bosses while succinctly establishing the motivation for Bayonetta's journey. The scoring system in Bayonetta 2 works much the same as it did in Bayonetta, with ranks being determined by time, combo, and damage taken. As per the Platinum norm, the player can earn Platinum rankings in all three categories to obtain the highest rank of Pure Platinum. Not getting hit nets you a Platinum in damage, simple enough, but unfortunately there's no way of knowing what combo value or amount of time in a verse is sufficient until you play it yourself. People have suggested various user interface solutions to this, such as a combo text changing color, a timer that ticks down, or small notifications that appear whenever a requirement is met or when the player runs out of time for each rank. There are plenty of solutions here, and I'm a little surprised that none of them have been implemented yet. That being said, the timer is fairly lenient for the most part. As long as your offense never ceases for too long, you're quite likely to platinum it. Combo is by far the most complicated requirement, and the most important factor in ensuring a platinum combo score is never allowing the combo meter to drop over the course of an encounter. A large combo multiplier built over an entire fight will always beat out multiple smaller value ones, so playing passively is heavily penalized. In this system where maintaining and building the combo meter is critically important, which time and dodge offset are the player's main defensive options. Both these techniques function in such a way that a skilled player can remain on the offensive as long as their defensive abilities are up to par. Dodging at the last second before an attack, or immediately after they get hit if they bought Bat Within, activates Witch Time, temporarily freezing time and increasing the amount of combo points that attacks earn. It's essential for a player to become comfortable using the technique because the most difficult enemies can only be reasonably damaged during Witch Time. Correctly dodging to activate it isn't incredibly difficult, but the skill ceiling for it is quite high, since a player who didn't take damage but also didn't achieve Witch Time off every enemy attack still has room to improve. Dodge offset is a technique that allows the player to resume their combo path after dodging by holding down their last attack button they pressed during their evasive movement. One of the most frustrating experiences a new player of Bayonetta will encounter is dropping combos while attempting to avoid damage, and dodge offset remedies this, making even the longest combos viable against enemies that attack frequently, provided the player is skilled enough. Perhaps the most significant change to Bayonetta 2's combat system is the removal of the first game's diminishing returns on basic punches and kicks. In order to dissuade players from spamming basic attacks, the original Bayonetta penalized players by decreasing the amount of points standard melee hits were worth until the player performed a Wicked Weave to reset punching and kicking back to their original values. Many enemies in the sequel, especially bosses, are much more aggressive than in the first game, allowing few opportunities to ever combo an enemy without interruption. When the only safe opportunity for Bayonetta to attack is Witch Time, diminishing returns have little impact on the combo score, so the change makes sense. On another note, I'm a bit confused as to why the game doesn't have the menu option to restart from the last checkpoint like Metal Gear Rising does. In Rising, the restart option allows a player to attempt an encounter again without having to redo an entire chapter up to that point. It was particularly useful because a player that performed well but then made one mistake during a fight could try again and salvage a decent chapter ranking. I have no way of knowing if Bayonetta 2 is attempting to discourage players from doing this, but if they aren't, then there's no reason for this feature not to exist again. It's still possible to restart fights by going to the start menu and returning all the way to the title screen, so the removal of restart is just slightly more annoying than anything else. Unlike the Devil May Cry series, Bayonetta lacks a style meter that incentivizes using different weapons. This means that someone can go through the entire game only using the default Love is Blue set of guns if they want without being penalized, but the game encourages players to experiment with its myriad weapons by giving away 3 of them just for playing through the game. To unlock the others, players must seek out Angelic Hymn Gold LP fragments, but in a smart design decision, a chapter will only contain the necessary parts to put together one weapon. This may not seem that important by itself, but it influences the game more than I had first realized. While personally I didn't think the fragments were especially difficult to find, a player that manages to find a fragment and finish the level knows immediately that the rest of the pieces are still hidden in that same chapter. Since there are so many different weapons in the game, it would be a tremendous hassle to have fragments for all of them scattered across multiple levels, and I can't really understate the feeling of progression the game evokes by vastly growing Bayonetta's arsenal chapter by chapter, as opposed to completing a bunch of weapons near the end of the game in quick succession. Since this is an action game, the weapons a player has available to them are obviously very important, but even more so in Bayonetta, because without a style meter to encourage weapon swapping, they have to be both fun and useful enough to warrant their inclusion. The first Bayonetta managed to have an impressive amount of weapons, but quite a few of them were variants of Scarborough Fair, her starting guns. If you exclude Onyx Roses, Bazillions, the handguns, and Pillow Talk, which is a modified version of the sword Shuraba, then Bayonetta has 8 unique weapons. By comparison, Bayonetta 2 has 10, excluding the old ones it retains from the first game, extra characters in multiplayer, and the Umbran armor since that's more of an Umbran climax change despite it having its own moveset. It's a difficult prospect to design so many weapons for an action game while trying to make all of them useful, unique, and balanced, but Bayonetta 2 accomplishes this with flying colors. This is in large part due to the individual mechanics of each weapon. For example, the Alruna whips can slam most enemies into the floor, which stuns them and is incredibly useful if not borderline broken against weaker enemies, but it's balanced by the fact that Bayonetta can only lasso more powerful enemies if they're stunned or she's in witch time. This is fair, as in both these situations Bayonetta is already in a position where she has the advantage and is being rewarded for it. Undyne with its fire and ice elements is a parallel to Durga's mode switching from the first game, but the former's frost form in particular deserves special mention because it has the ability to temporarily freeze almost any enemy in the entire game. This includes giant opponents, most bosses, and to my surprise, even the optional boss. Another weapon, Take Mikazuchi, is a slow electric hammer that possesses a drive that can be charged up to unleash a massive blow, and also buffs the hammer to do more damage temporarily. I guess Radon was lying in the first game when he said he wasn't going to strap a chainsaw to Bayonetta's arms, because the Salamandra fits that description perfectly. Amusingly, if you put them on her feet, she'll turn them on and glide across the floor instead of running, which is hilarious to watch. Salamandra deals powerful multi-hit attacks, but has its own unique just-release mechanic. If a player holds down the attack button while using it until the blades glow red and then release it, Bayonetta will perform an extra attack for an enormous amount of damage. I wish Platinum would incentivize using different weapons in the scoring system, but since they're all viable and such a pleasure to use, players can play however they want. One of the greatest strengths of the weapon system in the Bayonetta games is the freedom to customize her 2 weapon loadouts for both arms and feet, which allows for up to 4 different weapons equipped at a time. In Devil May Cry 4, you could switch between all available weapons at any given time, but for me personally, it was annoying to press the toggle button so many times to keep switching between the weapons I wanted to use. In addition, it's easy to press the button too many times and go straight past the weapon you wanted. Making up for this easy mistakes takes several more button presses, and the basic task of weapon switching can quickly become tiring. For this reason, I prefer Bayo's loadout system where the player can still use any weapons they want if they bring up a menu, but makes a minor commitment to having 2 loadouts. I can certainly understand why people might prefer DMC4's handling of weapon swapping, but I'm partial to only having to press the switching button once to get to the desired weapon. All of this aside, I reached a point somewhere around the middle of the game where I was like a kid in a candy store. I thoroughly enjoyed all the weapons I found, but I just kept getting more and more. A game hasn't made me feel like that in a long time, and I think that says a lot about the quality of the overall weapon design. Chapter 3 features the Glamour enemy as a boss, and while the scenario for the fight is interesting, it suffers from several gameplay flaws as a result. The fight begins with Bayonetta surfing on some rubble up a colossal vortex of water until she reaches the Gates of Paradiso, where she transitions into an aerial fight against multiple Glamours in the sky. The two environments are gorgeous, but the surfing section is much more interesting visually than it is mechanically, because all there is to it is dodging easy-to-see rubble and a small handful of boss attacks. I'm of the opinion that the pacing could have benefited from this segment being a fair bit shorter, and quite a few bosses in the first game had similar issues with lengthy introductory sequences as well. The second phase of the fight against Glamour is pretty traditional as far as Bayonetta bosses go, but I'm not convinced that the flying contributed to the gameplay in any meaningful way. There are quite a few points in between the boss's attacks where Bayonetta simply hovers far away from Glamour, unable to hit with any close-ranged weaponry. Since Umbran's spear is disabled, Bayo is forced to hold down the attack button while having a gun equipped, spam Y, or fire the Kafka bow until the boss attacks or otherwise presents another opportunity to get closer. Because Bayonetta can do little to adjust her position relative to the boss during these breaks, it feels like downtime more than anything else. Other mid-air fights like Gamora or Valor suffer from this problem much less frequently, since there's a greater amount of time spent near those bosses. Glamour is probably my least favorite Bayonetta 2 boss, but it honestly isn't a terrible fight, and despite the issues with surfing and flying, the set pieces were pretty unique. Veterans of the first Bayonetta will be familiar with the Alfheims, the secret verses that impose specific restrictions upon the player, not unlike the hidden missions in the Devil May Cry series. In order to get the pure platinum ranking for an entire level, a player needs to pure platinum all the individual verses, and this includes Alfheims. Their locations in the levels were cleverly hidden, but I was never a fan of the sheer amount of backtracking involved with finding a lot of them. Bayonetta 2 still requires the player to retrace their steps in order to find all the hidden verses in a chapter, but it's generally much less time-consuming than before. For me, the worst challenges in the first game are those that had the least room for creativity, like the ones that limit how many punches or kicks Bayonetta can use, or the stay in the air for however many seconds challenges that generally amounted to spamming jump cancel or the Kolshedra whip. The combination of tiresome backtracking and the possibility of getting an Alfheim I don't want to play makes replaying the first game for better scores more tedious than it needs to be. While I personally don't like some of the stranger Alfheims, I appreciate that they often provide a nice change of pace from trying to master the game's main mechanics. However, it's one thing to offer rewards like Broken Witch Hearts and Moon Pearls as a reward for bizarre one-time challenges, and entirely another to expect the player to do them every time they want a chance at a better score. Thankfully, Bayonetta 2's version of these tasks, Muspelheims, ruined several of the first game's challenges and replaced others with more interesting tasks, such as the first game's stay in the air for a number of seconds being modified to Bayonetta not being able to touch the ground until all the enemies are defeated. This is a far more interesting premise, as a player can attempt to defend the starting platforms they start out on, or try to clear out the enemies as quickly as possible. Alfheims and Muspelheims are both somewhat forgiving in that only successful completions factor into your score, which is a nice concession to make since the challenges test different skills than what the player is accustomed to. One bizarre complaint I've heard about the game is that it's easier than the first Bayonetta. While I wouldn't necessarily disagree that the difficulty is toned down, at least on second climax compared to the first game's normal, there's several aspects of this assertion that I take issue with. First of all, to even make that kind of comparison, you have to have played through the first game, which automatically gives you experience with Bayonetta's combat system. The games are similar enough to where that translates into a significant advantage that people who never played the original don't have. Secondly, if players came to this conclusion simply based on a comparison of the scores they received on average in both Bayonettas, their results may be extremely skewed. The prevalence of the infamous press X not to die QuickTime events of the first game may have adversely affected people's perceptions of the difficulty, because failing these even once absolutely tanks the end of chapter score. This is made worse by the fact that, unlike the rest of the game, a player couldn't exit to the title screen to retry the event. The second they failed the QuickTime event, Bayonetta would die and the game immediately autosaved. Those QuickTime events were an absurdly moronic design decision that could instantly ruin someone's run, while being completely unrelated to the core gameplay. I'm very glad they never made an appearance in the second game because they weren't fun in the slightest, and I hope they never see the light of day again. Compounding these two issues is the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, Alfheim chapters factor into the score. A player that performed well during the main missions but missed out on Alfheims either because they didn't think to backtrack through the chapter or because they didn't want to can still get fairly low scores, since entirely missing out on verses brings the whole average down. Finally, even if the sequel is easier to play to completion than the first on the normal difficulty, that's not an inherently bad thing. A hard mode and non-stop infinite climax still exist, and the score system that takes multiple factors into account for each individual encounter is a far better indicator of player skill than the number of attempts it took someone to beat something. Even if every difficulty level is easier, saying the sequel is a worse game simply because of it doesn't make any sense, because clearing the game doesn't necessarily mean you performed in any exceptional way. Dedicated fans of the genre aren't content with simply clearing an encounter. They want to do it while maximizing their score. Conversely, casual players who don't care about their rankings but simply want to experience the game's content are encouraged to do so. Items that lower your score but grant powerful boons to the player are commonplace, and there's even an easy mode to accommodate people who just want to complete the game. It's the best of both worlds because there's challenge and depth for those who appreciate that sort of thing, while giving less adept players the ability to at least dip their feet in the pool. I truly believe that the people who only play the game once without trying to improve or master the combat are missing out on what makes these kinds of action games so enjoyable and satisfying, but it's unreasonable to expect everyone to want the same thing out of a game. Chapter 4 introduces the Masked Lumen, and if you care about story spoilers, now would be the time to turn back. Giving the Lumen a mask to begin with was a strange decision because from the audience's perspective, the only reason for him to be wearing a mask is that the player could be familiar with his identity already. Bayonetta doesn't have many characters, and of the two from the first game who have any kind of Lumen abilities, it's probably not the optional boss. Bayonetta's understandably not expecting a Baldur from the past to come to her time, so it's far more shocking to her than it is to someone that paid any amount of attention to the first game. Maybe Platinum cared less about his identity than his motivation or how he traveled to the future, or maybe the player figuring out who was behind the mask was less important than Bayonetta finding out at the right time. But in any case, it presents an opportunity to fight a Lumen Sage in his prime. There are 3 Lumen Sage encounters in total, and they're probably the best fights in the game, or in my opinion, the entire series. One of the reasons for this is that the Masked Lumen has a similar skill set to Bayonetta. He can morph into a wolf that mimics her panther form, he has his own Wicked Weaves that summon parts of various angels, and he can even parry her attacks like a player can when equipped with the Moon of Mahakala accessory. All of this signifies that the Lumen is Bayonetta's equal. The fight will come down to the player's skill. One of the most interesting aspects of the fight is the way the Sage never feels like a punching bag. Trying to land a hit on him outside of Witch Time is difficult because he's constantly blocking and dodging Bayonetta's attacks, and he doesn't take very many hits in succession before breaking out and trying to resume his offensive. It's a definite behavioral contrast to other enemies in the game up to this point, and his fluid combat style does a great job of mirroring how the player is likely to fight. After the first phase, the Sage summons one of the boss angels from the first game, while Bayonetta summons a demon of her own to match him. The fight resumes, but this time the angel and demon fighting in the background reflect the player and Lumen in the foreground. I can't overstate how genuinely cool this is, and shutting down the Lumen Sage when he attempts to have the angel attack you from the background results in an insanely satisfying counterattack from the player's demon. When the third phase occurs, both characters summon even more powerful companions and Bayonetta assumes her demonic wings again. Unlike the fights against Glamour and Gamora, her flight form against human opponents doesn't suffer from a lack of mobility. Bayonetta can readjust her position at any point, easily closing in the distance between herself and the boss. After dealing even more damage, the player is rewarded with a short fistfight section where they get to play as Madama Butterfly before the fight concludes. Earlier I mentioned that I was disappointed with the infernal demons in the first game only showing up to finish off opponents the player had already defeated. In contrast, Bayonetta 2's Lumen Sage fights do an incredible job of incorporating the summons into the gameplay, making them feel like a tool at the player's disposal rather than some power-only cutscene Bayonetta can use. The farther a player gets through Bayonetta 2, the more apparent it becomes that Platinum did a stellar job with the enemy variety. Barely any angels from the first game get reused until later in the story, and even then there's a narrative reason for the old ones to appear. Bayonetta's enemies aren't like those in the Wonderful 101 in that the player doesn't need any specific tools to deal with them. This means that it would have been easy to recycle all sorts of angels from the original title, which had so many to begin with. This quote by the game's director Yusuke Hashimoto sums up the situation perfectly. It shows massive dedication on the part of the development team to create so many brand new angel and demon enemies, and the game is much better off for it. Just like the first Bayonetta, the sequel has an abundance of references to previous Platinum, Capcom, and Clover titles. Some are less subtle than others. I probably heard Diplomacy has failed more than I needed to, even if I laughed like an idiot every time. But perhaps my favorite was the fact that the demons drop orbs as currency like enemies in the Devil May Cry series. There's a lot of attention to detail in the game, and little touches like the way Loki is still attached to Bayonetta when she's in her animal forms, or the different ways of unsealing the fighting arena depending on whether she's fighting angels or demons, exemplify the same kind of work ethic that the enemy design does. Platinum didn't have to add these in, but they did. One of Bayonetta 2's brand new additions is Tag Climax, a multiplayer co-op mode where two players compete against each other for the best score against whatever enemy encounters they choose. For some reason, there's no local co-op at all. The player can only pair up with someone else or an AI. The mode allows all unlockable characters that are playable in the single player, along with a couple of multiplayer exclusive ones as well. The solo game does a great job of maintaining 60 frames per second most of the time, but when two players are creating all sorts of effects on the screen, the game can get bogged down pretty frequently. Overall, the mode is a nice diversion and I had quite a bit of fun with it, but the jump to two players can make it exponentially more difficult to tell what's happening on screen, and honestly I would have just preferred being able to play the multiplayer characters in the main campaign. Earlier, I briefly mentioned that the game is tuned around enemies being extremely aggressive, but this philosophy and its influence on how Witch Time now operates leads to a huge issue on the highest difficulty. Attacks outside of Witch Time are next to useless against humanoid bosses. They dodge and block almost every normal and Wicked Weave attack to the point where doing anything except firing the guns to keep up the combo score until the next dodge is risky and unrewarding. This in turn decreases combo variety because even if you dodge offset perfectly, your combo probably won't connect after Witch Time ends anyway. This incentivizes players to abuse the manual Witch Time accessory because chaining Witch Times back to back is the only way the player can be sure their attacks will land. It's not like there's any good alternative for them to spend their magic gauge on either, since even Umbran Climax isn't guaranteed to connect. This is probably the single largest issue in the game because it runs counter to the idea that a skilled player can constantly stay on the offensive as long as they avoid damage. When Witch Time is the only opening for attacks, there's no room for creativity at all because the combo has to end before time resumes in order to be effective. Design like this that limits the player's options and penalizes skill is a huge mistake, and I'm baffled that Platinum actually didn't see the problem with this before release. An easy fix would be to make it so bosses are guaranteed to be hit by Wicked Weaves even if they aren't stunned. At least that way there would be a reason to use longer combos that end with multiple weaves. I'm of the opinion that Bayonetta's universe and lore is more interesting than the immediate story of either game, but I will say that I think the sequel benefits from having clearer objectives and needing to spend less time introducing characters. Furthermore, the second game's ending is clever in that it clears up a misconception both the player and Bayonetta would hold after the events of the first game. A decent number of people who bought Bayonetta 2 may not have started with the first game despite it being packaged with its successor, so it's possible that Platinum wanted to incentivize these players to go back and experience it. Loki is a character some could easily find annoying, but he rarely sees the opportunity to actually get away with being snarky as Bayonetta humorously bullies him in most of their conversations. Besides that, he makes up for all the times Bayo saves him near the end, and he's never in an awkward escort mission like Cereza in the first game, so it's easy to tolerate him even if his attitude is off-putting. As far as bratty side characters go, you could do much worse. Bayonetta 2 is well paced for the vast majority of the game, but the sequences near the end suffer from a complete lack of any build-up or tension. Metal Gear Rising, The Wonderful 101, and the original Bayonetta all had incredible ending sections, and while it would be difficult to top those games, I feel that Bayonetta 2's ending chapters aren't anywhere near as memorable. This can largely be attributed to the sequences before the final boss encounter in each game. The first Bayonetta transitions into the last boss fights after a tower section, in which Bayonetta refought most of the adversaries she had bested over the course of the game. By this point, the player has become much more proficient, and Bayonetta has access to a slew of new abilities and weapons, so the level exemplifies how much both have grown since the beginning of the game. It's a literal, and figurative, ascension, and it really added a sense of anticipation for a final boss which towered over everything else. Following that is a hectic motorcycle ride into space to fight an enemy on an entirely different scale from anything Bayonetta has ever seen. In Bayonetta 2, you still battle standard enemies and bosses from earlier, but this has been reduced to a minigame sequence that, while entertaining, does little to prepare the player for the final encounter like the first game did. After the jet fighter segment, the player can choose to tackle an optional Muspelheim, but after that it's a quick jaunt up some stairs that immediately lead to the final boss. It's pretty anticlimactic, which is a bit strange considering most Platinum titles have insanely memorable climaxes. Excuse the pun. I want to stress that it's the ending chapter's scenarios I take issue with, because I actually believe Bayonetta 2's final boss is considerably better in terms of gameplay. But the first game's scenarios were so brilliant that they transformed an otherwise average fight into something greater than the sum of its parts. Perhaps the best praise I can give Bayonetta 2 compared to the original is that it's extremely solid throughout its entirety. When I consider replaying the first Bayonetta, I can easily recall some sections of the game that might dissuade me from returning to it, and I can't say the same thing about the sequel. It might not be as memorable or innovative as its predecessor, but where Bayonetta 2 really excels is in its refinement of the series' formula. Its visuals are more vibrant, its weapons have more variety and are better balanced, the pacing is vastly improved, and there are fewer gimmicks overall. It foregoes introducing a ton of new concepts in favor of improving what already existed, which is a fairly safe way to do a sequel. This makes Bayonetta 2 consistently great, but it also means that the game takes fewer risks than the original. Mechanically, I'm inclined to say the second game is superior, but which of the two a player prefers overall likely comes down to whether they would rather play a game that frequently experiments to varying degrees of success, or a game that is excellent throughout but remains fairly static. Regardless, Bayonetta 2 is still one of the greatest games of its genre, and it absolutely deserves its almost universal acclaim. Maybe there won't be more of the Bayonetta world to see, or perhaps Bayonetta 3 is waiting just around the bend, but whatever the case may be, Platinum has demonstrated that they can cross the action game river in style.